Hello and welcome to the Digital Publishing Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me for this first ever episode, where I was lucky enough to be joined by the fantastic Richard Orme, CEO of the DAISY Consortium, to talk about his fascinating story and the ways that accessibility bridges the technology and publishing spheres. I really hope you enjoy. Hello, Richard. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 1 of the Digital Publishing Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Simon. Wow, number one.
Number 1, yes, hopefully of many. Still stacking up the guests. I'm really thrilled to have you here as our first guest. No pressure, of course, yeah. Everything's fine. Richard and I have known each other for many years now. We were just trying to figure out when. But actually preparing for this podcast, Richard, it's the first time I've seen your kind of full bio blurb. And wow, there's a lot on there. It's amazing. I actually didn't know about all of that stuff. But I think before we dig into it, perhaps let's just begin by introducing you to people who don't know you. Could you just tell me a little bit about your work at DAISY?
Sure. So I'm Richard Orme. I'm Chief Executive at the DAISY Consortium. So DAISY is the international non-profit organisation that is basically focused on access to information for people with disabilities. So we're made up of non-profit member organisations. So we're an association. We've got members all around the world. Many of them are libraries serving people with print disabilities. And then we also have organisations, commercial organisations that support our work, big brand names, but also organisations that make products specifically for people with print disabilities.
Amazing. Such a range. How does DAISY fund itself?
So our funding comes from two main sources. So I mentioned we're a membership organisation. So our members pay an annual membership fee to us. That funding allows us to basically employ accessibility experts, and we've got some global experts in our team. And we develop tools, technologies, standards, best practices that our member organisations then use to deliver their services for people with print disabilities. So rather than folk having to develop their own technical standards or their own recording tools, conversion tools, production tools, validation tools, we make those on behalf and together with the whole kind of DAISY family, as it were. So those membership fees critical to us being able to deliver what our members need. And then about roughly 50% of our funding comes for specific funded projects. They could actually also be from our members. So at the moment, we're being supported by our members to develop a new format for digital Braille, together with our members and lots of other Braille using organisations around the world.
Can you just talk about that for a moment? Because digital Braille is so fascinating to people who have not seen it before. I remember the first time I had a demo of a digital Braille display. Could you describe these for us?
Yeah. So people will probably be familiar with printed Braille. That's Braille that's embossed, is the terminology, onto paper that enables people to read using their fingers. So at DAISY, we talk about reading through eyes, ears, and fingers. So this is the fingers part. Braille is an incredibly important tool for literacy, for folk who read through their fingers. Lots of evidence that shows education attainment, independence, success in employment, and so on, is closely correlated with people's access to being able to read Braille. But printed Braille is bulky, and so there's a lot of interest in digital reading. So this is where you would use a device that uses plastic pins, and they're pushed up to form the various Braille characters. It could be a small device that is kind of virtually pocketable, or it could even be a computer that has its own kind of keyboard with it, either a Braille style keyboard or with 6 or 8 keys, or with a QWERTY keyboard, and they can often be their own kind of computers. Basically, they're used all around the world. And so the format then that we're developing, which we're calling eBraille at the moment, with organisations, is basically bringing a lot of the superpowers of digital reading that folk who are working with print materials now benefit from. So especially navigation and the ability to kind of personalize the representation of that material for the user and for the user to be able to have that power. So with digital braille, you'd want to be able to maybe change the formatting of that braille as an individual to be able to easily navigate around to maybe the print page numbers, those sorts of things. So
right, I think that's something that people don't think about when we're talking about screen reading technology, about just you take for granted when you can look at a book, your ability to skip through it, to navigate through the book, to use a table of contents, to go to the next section, all of this stuff. You think it's something that people generally don't realize is often a challenge for non-sighted readers.
Some books have images in them too. So current technologies for representing braille, there isn't really the ability to handle images in there too. So the new eBraille format will also have in it the ability to include images, which could be represented on a full or multi-line tactile display. So these now exist and would enable someone to be able to maybe explore that image, to zoom in on it. And if they have a device that can't represent that, then that would still then render gracefully, maybe providing the equivalent of alt text for it, for example. So one could see how the new devices, the new digital production techniques allows for a kind of new generation of access to digital braille that will, bring really interesting options for folk reading educational material, music, STEM materials, topics such as geography, all those sorts of things. You need more than the kind of text experience.
Right.
Yeah.
I find it so interesting how just because of the structure of digital formats in general, we can bring so much of the meaning of a book beyond just the words itself, or the meaning of a publication beyond just the words itself, and to really bring that the full reading experience and everything you could do if you could see the work into whatever format people want, whatever mode people want to use, rather than trying to sort of second guess what would be helpful. Do you think EPUB has a particularly unique role there?
Yeah, but EPUB is only one of the formats. So DAISY's mission really is about enabling access to information to everyone, irrespective of disabilities. We as DAISY invented a format, the DAISY format, and after that, we've been very involved in the development of the EPUB standard, but we don't promote a specific standard over another one. We're about access to digital, accessible reading, whatever format is being deployed, and there are good reasons why you would use different formats. So EPUB has loads of great benefits. I mean, the fact that it's based on web technologies, so it comes with lots of built-in kind of accessibility potential. And some things that lend itself to reading, such as you just referred to some of them in respect to the Braille side of things, the navigation, the ability to go to a page, for example, is hard to do in HTML, but it's built right into the kind of EPUB ecosystem, as it were.
Right, and particularly in an academic context, if somebody's talking about going to a particular page, right? Very important to be able to.
That's one example, but it's also important if you're in a reading group or in a book club or something like that too. So yeah, so that's an example of so many great benefits to digital reading. And a really important piece here is that we started as DAISY, focused on solutions for the specialist libraries, developing specialist formats, hoping that the mainstream world would adopt those. But actually, the board and the DAISY membership, our approach now is really to build accessibility into the mainstream experiences, so that folk who read specialist materials aren't kind of limited to that disability ghetto, that they could be using the same format to read mainstream books and mainstream publications. They could use the same apps that they use for mainstream titles,
Right.
and the devices that are being used, would support materials that have been produced accessibly, whether they've come from a specialist organization or whether they've come from a mainstream publisher that is producing accessible content without even having to think about it. Yeah. So you asked where DAISY got its funding from. That was an example, the eBraille format of funded projects. And we do so much more, including work to bring accessible publishing and reading to low and middle income countries. That's a significant part of our work. It's pretty well developed in European, North American countries and other industrialized nations, but there are many parts of the world we know from talking with people with print disabilities, many people who've never been able to read a book themselves. They've always relied on someone else reading to them. And by support from local NGOs and transferring the latest knowledge and free tools that are available now, we can extend access to reading to parts of the world that don't currently enjoy that.
Brilliant. I mean, you talk about people not necessarily having to use specialist libraries or specialist services. What role do you see for legislation in this, particularly as it's evolving now, in ensuring that kind of the mainstream is in itself accessible?
Legislation is one of the drivers to a world that is more accessible. And, if we think about the change that happens, regulation is in there, just as revenue is in there. People's relationships are in there. They may know people with print disabilities or other disabilities that may drive them to do things. Reputation is in there too. It's good for companies to be able to show that they are taking a broad and responsible approach to their activities. So I see it as one of the levers, to be honest. Right now, there's a lot of focus on the European Accessibility Act because it has specific provisions for ebooks and for the ebook ecosystem. Actually, it's not just the content, it's also the devices, it's also the websites that you would use to discover, to buy, to borrow books too. So that's a big change within Europe, but also that's what publishers and accessibility organizations are talking about right now in countries that go well beyond Europe, because of course that's a very big marketplace.
Right. Richard, we've talked a lot about DAISY and about accessibility, and anybody listening who's kind of in the accessibility space, which is thankfully buzzing right now, has probably heard you speak somewhere or read you somewhere. But I think a lot of people don't know about your own history, about how you came to be in this position and such a notable advocate in the industry for accessibility. Now, I read in your bio that this actually goes back to a college talking to young farmers. Could you just tell us a little bit about that and how you got going?
I would say I started, I suppose, growing up with a brother with a severe disability and having an auntie with a severe disability. And that's where I first started playing with adaptations to make things more possible for them and learning from them and so on. But my first experience of accessible access to information was when I was teaching at a further education college in rural England. I was doing a year out from my computer science degree, so I was teaching access to computers to agricultural students, one of whom happened to be blind. So I had to figure out how I was going to make the course and the course content and actually the other reading that he needed for his other subjects accessible to Mike. So we had great fun playing with a very, very early speech synthesizer, the BBC Micro, and it was a lot of fun. Mike and I are still friends. He's doing great stuff. And we often kind of reminisce about, that first experience. I was so intrigued by this new technology, this text-to-speech technology, that and the fun problems I had to solve, but also what impact that made for Mike in terms of enabling him to learn. I then did my final year project when I returned to my college the next year, developing a solution for specialist schools with students who had profound cognitive and physical disabilities that was again making use of text-to-speech and also touchscreen technology. So it was a very early based touchscreen screen reader for the BBC Micro that was designed for younger pupils in school who could touch the symbols on the screen and then hear them. So it was kind of very early, what we now call an AAC device, kind of communication device, encouraging those young people to enabling them to express themselves, but also encouraging them to kind of learn using that type of technology. So that was the beginnings, and just very, very interesting problems to solve, but also great projects to working with really interesting end users and professionals working with them.
So do you think it's that combination of a kind of comp sci background and then sort of real life experience and meeting people and just finding these problems particularly fascinating to solve? Was that what really drove this for you?
So you're talking about technology and you're talking about people, and that's when I think that's what my career has been. Yeah, it's been fun stuff with tech, but a big part of it is the people side of things. So the people that I meet in the industries that I've had the privilege to work in, so that's telecoms, broadcasting, finance, transport, lots of government organisations. I spend a lot of time working with educators and employers too. A lot of it is about the people side of things. Obviously with the person with disabilities right at the centre of it, but also, there are advocates and champions within those organisations who may not be accessibility experts, but also want to be, are part of the solution. So, it's that blend between technology and people.
And do you consider yourself a developer, or do you think that's too reductive?
I was a developer in the past. In fact, that's how I began my career. My first job after graduating was with a small charity in London that was teaching teenagers, basically, who had disabilities, how to use technologies. It was a kind of path through to employment. So that was a lot of fun, got exposure to individuals with lots of different disabilities and also mental health survivors too, people who'd were kind of returning to the world of study and work. So again, that was great grounding for me in a whole range of individuals and their backstories, as it were.
Right.
So I worked there for a year and a half, and again learned more about computer adaptations on different platforms and so on. And then I saw a job role at RNIB, the Royal National Institute of Blind People, as it is now, for a systems programmer. So I joined them as a developer, and actually the first couple of projects I worked on were related to accessible reading.
Right. So really this goes back all through your career. One thing that stood out to me that I really wanted to ask you about was The Guardian. Because I think this is something I didn't know is quite fascinating. Could you just tell us about your experience there?
Yeah, so one of the two projects that I did when I joined RNIB was an amazing innovation concept, I suppose, at that stage. The Guardian newspaper, you may recall, or maybe you read about if you're younger, was one of the first newspapers to use computers for their production. I remember this happening, and very bright people at RNIB saw potential there, and the possibility of being able to take the text of a Guardian newspaper and make that accessible to people who weren't able to read the paper version as quickly as possible. Until that point, the way that people got access to newspaper content was that maybe there would be a digest produced, obviously some days afterwards, and produced maybe in hard copy braille, or there'll be an audio version. So someone would maybe read.
Delay.
Yeah, and you would get some of the stories. So they would be picked, not for you, but for the people who might have access to that. So the concept was, could one take advantage of the fact that the full text potentially of the Guardian newspaper was available actually at the same time that it was being printed, and then made available through some of this, again, pretty early, talking computers, computers with screens where the text could be made larger and maybe even rendered in digital braille that we talk about a little bit earlier. So I was brought in as the kind of technical architect and the systems and the programmer, basically. It was a very small team working on that. And The Guardian was an amazing partner. We had the managing editor part of our steering group.
Wow.
So they were really bought into it. So it ended up with the Guardian would go to print. They would push a button. It would get sent to a company that would then basically broadcast the full text of the newspaper using the TV signal. This was before the internet.
What?
The TV signal had what they called the vertical blanking interval. That was the space in which teletext was broadcast. But there was space within that. So we utilized the space within that. Then there was a decoder card on PCs. So people would have a TV aerial going back in the back of the PC. There would be a card, decoder card, and then the software that I wrote would then receive that signal, would then process that content, and then also had a reading system that enabled someone then to navigate through the different editions of the newspaper, the different sections of the newspaper, the articles, and obviously one would have the facility to be able to search and to bookmark and those sorts of things. And then for the users of the newspaper, they could choose to read this in large print on the screen. They could have it output through different synthesizers that we supported. So this was not using a screen reader, it was directly driving kind of external synthesizers they were then. They plugged in using a serial port or driving like a Braille device, great big thing, like a briefcase.
Wow.
And so that was a lot of fun. And if I just give you, a human, we said it was about people. So as part of our pilot group, there were people who were deafblind as part of this. So their access to information, if they were only able to read Braille, severely restricted. And they went from, access to what other people had kind of selected that they might be able to read. They would be able to emboss in Braille. In fact, even just embossing Braille is an expensive business because the cost of the paper. They went from that to being able to, I think it was about 4:30 in the morning of publication, they were then able to read the entire text of the Guardian newspaper, every article, to search and so on. We had university lecturers in history and in economics who were able to now refer to that day's newspaper and monitor that for their own kind of studies and so on. And we also installed it in public libraries from Glasgow down to Devon, so that people could go in and experience this kind of stuff. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. And RNIB's work was recognised with an award from the British Computer Society for that innovation too. It was truly groundbreaking and a lot of fun.
That was actually what I was going to ask you about in terms of reception. Did you get to hear from the people whose lives you'd impacted with that? People who were now getting all of the news, not just some of it, and faster?
So this may not be news to you, Simon, but technology sometimes goes wrong. So as we were in the pilot stage, we realized that sometimes people had a technical issue. So this actually was, we realized that at RNIB, we needed to develop some kind of support infrastructure as people were using computers for the electronic daily newspaper system and for other things. So RNIB developed like a network of computer volunteers, and that volunteering network still exists today. I remain a computer volunteer for RNIB, one of I think about 1,000 up and down the UK who will support someone who can contact the RNIB helpline and say, I have an issue, I've got an Alexa and I don't know how to connect it, or I've got a new mobile phone, or my computer isn't working, I think I've got a virus, all that kind of good stuff. And so someone who knows what they're doing with a computer and is police checked and knows about assistive technology, there are people who can go in and help. So through this project, I was the first support person going out in 1990 when the aerial had fallen out the back or something had gone wrong with a hard drive or something like that. So I had first-hand contact with people who are using this early access to newspaper systems. So yeah, lots of very, very positive feedback, and also feedback where things didn't work. So that's just as important, isn't it?
Right. It must have been very motivating to hear the direct impact of the things that you were building. Has that always been a part of it for you, sort of hearing people's real reactions and the difference you're making to their lives?
Yeah, I don't know that that's special to me, and it's not only the end users. Hopefully, in all our work, we can, when we're working with colleagues in industry, within our own organisation, and so on, that positive impact thing is a helpful motivator. But yeah, seeing the end results of one's work, that's basically what one's in a job to do. So yeah,
right. And you mentioned industry there, and I think this is really interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about Word to EPUB? Because I think particularly for people in publishing, this is a really interesting thing.
So at DAISY and disability organisations around the world would, of course, be working directly with the end beneficiaries of their organisations, but also there are great conversations that happen with industry. And at an international level, big tech is pretty important. So through my career, I've been fortunate enough to always have good and very positive relationships with amazing individuals working in organizations like Adobe and Amazon and Apple and Microsoft. And it was at a conversation with Microsoft at one point where we said it's great that professionals in the publishing industry can produce accessible ebooks using professional tools, but you've got a great tool in Word, which they've worked on adding in the accessibility checker and having support for the key elements that we see at DAISY as making an accessible document, such as structure and being able to make images accessible and with alt text and so on. Wouldn't it be great to be able to go from an accessible Word document to an accessible EPUB document? And they encouraged us to basically make a prototype, and that's what we did. And we released it quietly as a prototype, and it kind of just took off. Word to EPUB, I don't think of as a tool specifically for even for publishers. I see it really as a tool that enables small organizations, teachers, self-publishing authors to produce EPUB and not having to rely on tools that they're not familiar with, because it's just a plugin. You make an accessible Word document, you use the plugin, it will then generate the EPUB for you. And if you want to, you can do things like adding in the accessibility metadata, other metadata, cover images. You can do all those sorts of things too. And it also enables you to build tools into the workflow, such as EPUB check and ACE, for example, even Sigil and Thorium to kind of take the whole thing through. But we also do know that some publishers are using it because it's some of the tools they're using don't produce EPUB that is so well structured and accessible. Right. So to be able to have a tool where they can generate compliant EPUB with the accessibility things that they've bothered to put into their Word document, and then they can test out that works well for some publishers.
I think this is such an interesting topic. I was reading a lot about the docx format recently, and about all the amazing things in Word that people can do if they choose to format it correctly to actually ensure that the Word document they've created can be transformed into whatever comes next. Do you feel that people are still not fully grokking the capabilities of Word in terms of making, because they're not going to choose that as a sort of authoring format a lot of the time? I think there's a lack of awareness of the features and what people can do to help.
There's probably some neat statistic out there or soundbite, Simon, that describes what percentage of the capabilities of a complicated tool or sophisticated, I should say, tool like Word people actually end up using. And I see that all the time. And my wife is a editor of a journal, and I find it interesting to see the manuscripts that come in to her. How many people are using Word styles? How are people managing to put these things together?
Right.
And one of the things that we do with Word2EPUB is that we actually try to address common things that one sees and also warn people about things too. But, Microsoft are helping with this. They have the accessibility checker running in the toolbar by default now, and it'll tell people to investigate these things. So it's making it, I think, a lot easier for people to create accessible documents. The capabilities are all in the tool there. But, we at DAISY, we have free online courses on how to create accessible Word documents. And we use it actually as the basis of enabling non-profit organizations in low and middle income countries. There's lots of different ways that they could produce specialist content. We use Word at the heart of that now because it's such a commonly used tool. Volunteers and professionals coming in to work in those organizations usually have some understanding of it. And we use it as the place where you could take a document, you can then proofread it, clean it up, add the structure, add the accessibility features, and then generate from it accessible DAISY, accessible EPUB, audio, Braille. It's the kind of heart of that. So yeah, that's a core skill, knowing how to drive your word processor to build the accessibility features. And, we say this a lot within the accessibility kind of community. An accessible thing is usually a better thing for everyone. So doing things like using styles, for example, means that someone who's doing a long document, it saves them a lot of time to do that in terms of navigation, in terms of making changes to things. Certainly helps someone who's then cleaning that document up. That's just one example. Yeah.
Right. And in terms of the general, all of the things that we put in to make a kind of well-formed document for accessibility, it all relates to machine learning as well, right? Does this do you ever think about this, about how kind of adding all of these structural semantics might affect the ability of any kind of machine learning technology to use books or to use publications?
I mean, this is clearly a very intriguing area. I guess for the whole publishing industry, they must be thinking about what opportunities and also threats are coming with AI and machine learning. I mean, I'm from the world of inclusion and accessibility. So when we think about AI, we're kind of towards the beginning of what this looks like. So no one knows. I certainly don't know what this holds. But there's some obvious stuff, like could it actually make it more efficient for doing things like image descriptions? Well, that's kind of obvious one, with caveats around don't just rely on the AI to do that out of the box and never check it. But I use AI now when I've got a deck that I want to share with I'm producing that's got lots of images. I'll use some AI tools to speed up me making that deck accessible with that side of things. Then we're intrigued at DAISY to explore the potential of AI to make documents, maybe legacy documents, more accessible. And one of those things is understanding the structure and adding semantics into a document that doesn't have that. So that's kind of interesting. So we see people who maybe have ebooks that are published, and so this is what they'd be talking about their backlist perhaps, and they're saying, we need to make these accessible. What could be missing? So things like structure is one of the key things, where headings are in there, but they're not marked as headings. They're just a different class. So they look bigger and bolder, but they're not marked semantically. Why does that matter to someone using assistive technology? But that's that kind of navigation superpower and understanding that something actually is a heading and not just a piece of the kind of text. So that's why that's important to do from an accessibility and inclusion point of view. So lots of potential maybe to improve that, the efficiency of the process to add that semantic markup into past content. Again, just riffing on that theme of you don't just do it for accessibility, you do it because it brings you other benefits. If you've got that semantic markup so much better, surely, then in being able to reuse that content, repurpose that content if you understand how it's broken up and what hierarchy the headings have, what you might do in terms of exposing that in other customer experiences and so on. And then there's a very intriguing piece around how AI might impact within the assistive technologies or indeed within the reading experience. So imagine an experience where someone gets a complex document, which could even be fully accessible, Simon, but is hard to work through. If you're reading through your ears, or you have a reading difference that means that cognitively it is just hard to process that text, to be able to ask questions of that document using AI. So if you're a screen reader user, you get a complex document and you ask it, what is the dates for which, such and such appeared? And for it to be able to pull that information out, you could see how one big warning flags around, how much would you trust what it comes back with? But that's a very different interaction to having to work through or having to do a find or something like that in what could be pages and pages of information to be able to ask the AI to extract information for you. Some folk might benefit from a summary, for example, or simpler language or something like that. So, so really intriguing things around artificial intelligence that impact at the conversion and upgrading of legacy content, improving the efficiency when you're building new content, but helping with the workflow or maybe checking what's been done by a vendor or by your own team, and then impacting on the end user experience too, adding extra powers to either their specialist assistive technology or for every reader maybe within their reading app. Yeah, interesting times ahead.
Really, I mean, I've noticed when you're talking about production side of that, all of that was assisting people in creating or enriching markup rather than AI go do it. Do you feel that that's still an important factor, that kind of humans have a role in these processes rather than trying to completely deputize the Borg to do it?
I guess there could be applications of AI that are lower risk. But the one that people often think about, because they see it, see examples of it, is image descriptions. You can take an image and you can be wowed by what the AI does in terms of description. But is that actually the purpose of that image in that context? Was that image already, was that description already actually referenced within the text surrounding it? All that kind of stuff. And I've enjoyed using AI for some meeting summaries and things like that. Can help with that. But golly, it can make very confident assertions about things that were never discussed. So just always that thing around be careful, because I remember there was a wonderful speaker that I booked for a conference once. He was a futurologist. What a job title.
Oh, I love that title.
And he said, half of the things I'm going to tell you are absolutely on the money and half of them are completely off the wall and never going to happen. I just can't tell you which half is which. And I think that's where we are with AI. We can talk about the proportions.
That's perfect.
But, so it can be really helpful in some places, but it can tell us complete rubbish in others. So I think, but I'm excited for AI because if it isn't 100% of the solution, it's definitely some of the solution, which means more stuff can get done. More stuff can be made accessible. And if it's AI in the hands of end users, they have choices around whether or not they might. If they get something without an image description, say on social media, they have the potential to be able to get a description of that and then maybe make some judgments.
Right. Richard, I thought it was probably a leading question when I asked you about this, because I just wrote an article for Inclusive Publishing at DAISY about this topic of AI for accessibility remediation. Could you talk to us a little bit about Inclusive Publishing at DAISY and what that is for people who aren't familiar?
So DAISY began as an organisation, a membership organisation of specialist libraries producing materials for people with print disabilities, basically pooling their resources and developing solutions for themselves. So that's amazing. But some years ago, the organisations concluded also that part of their mission was to make information accessible that may not have been produced by the specialist organizations, but by other organizations. And so intending for all the wonderful stuff that's developed by the whole DAISY Consortium to be adopted and used by other producers of information. And of course, publishers are a big part of that whole publishing ecosystem. We were so pleased to get a very significant grant from the Google Foundation some years ago that helped us basically work with W3C to put together the accessibility specification for EPUB. As part of that, we also put together the Accessible Publishing Knowledge Base, the ACE tool, the Accessible Checker for EPUB, and also a website that was intended to be a hub for information all about inclusive publishing. So we use the term inclusive publishing to maybe slightly distinguish from the work of our members who are usually producing specifically for people with print disabilities. This is about if something is produced as a digital document, for example, as whether that's a digital magazine, an ebook, a document, that should be produced with as many users in mind as possible. And there's no reason that someone with a print disability should necessarily have to have a special version made for them, or that should be made in a special version. Wouldn't it be great if the formats that are used by people who don't identify with a specific need is also that same document is available to someone with a reading difference? So we talk about the same document or the same book at the same time, in the same place, and at the same price. So not specialist versions, not people having to wait, like people had to wait for newspapers in the past. We talked about that earlier. Not a special version that might be missing some things, and not a more expensive, and maybe not a free version either. People want to be able to buy and borrow books in the same way that their family members and friends do who don't have accessibility needs. So that's what inclusive publishing is all about, and we continue that work, that inclusive publishing work. It now goes long after the original funding from Google expired, because our board and our membership support this as part of the broader DAISY Consortium mission. Many of our members are working hard on that agenda within their countries and internationally, to partnering with publishers, as they always have done. Actually, that's something that goes back decades. But instead of the publishers providing them maybe with source files, or the authors recording special talking books for them, as well as all that good stuff happening, now the publishers are getting advice from DAISY members who have spent decades producing accessible titles, understanding how to build accessibility into what they're doing. The notion being that if a book is born digital, it can also be born accessible.
Right. No, that makes sense. Rich, I noticed as you're talking, you continually sort of reflect about international scope and not just domestic. I'm conscious DAISY as a NISO standard, and you as a board member of the Accessible Books Consortium. Is this always something that's central in your mind when you're thinking through these issues, these sort of international perspective, or do you find yourself focusing on the UK?
Definitely not focusing on the UK, other than in my kind of volunteering work, I suppose. But things can't just happen at an international level. So DAISY exists because, the sum of all our members is more than the individual parts. So to shift things, so to create a DAISY format that was internationally adopted meant that then manufacturers across the world, in China, in Japan, in the US, Canada, elsewhere, could make devices. If they're software companies, they could be making production tools and so on that wouldn't serve a market in an individual country, but then work for the DAISY format, knowing that was being used on every continent in lots of different languages, and actually being used to produce content in different that could be read in different ways too. So things happening at an international level is really important. That also works when it comes to working with mainstream technology companies and, of course, publishing formats. We don't have books that are produced in one format in one country and a different format in another country. So that holds true for building those accessibility solutions and provisions into those formats too. But the national level is also really, really important, because there are national considerations, cultural considerations, legal considerations, and maybe even technical considerations too. So that's where I think we have this wonderful mix within DAISY of an organization working at an international level and our members working amazingly well at a national level, sometimes regional level too, to take those solutions and make sure that they are, well, first of all, to be involved in the development of the solutions so that the needs are captured appropriately and translated into standards, best practices, tools and solutions, but also to take those tools and deploy them so that they actually get into the hands of people with disabilities. So a good example of that is that eBraille work that I mentioned. So through working at an international level, we're developing a specification that doesn't just meet an organization that has a specific requirement, but developing a specification is easy. Actually getting it used and deployed is important too. So we, around the table are not only organizations that produce Braille, but the organizations that produce the tools for creating Braille, the devices that people use to read Braille, and importantly, organizations of disabled people and Braille users also who are part of that whole discussion as we develop the specification, the use cases, the sample documents, and so on. Yeah. So international and national, really important. And you mentioned the UK, but my own work, of course, is an international role, and as well as working with DAISY member organizations, wherever they happen to be. We work on leading the world towards inclusive publishing ecosystems. That, of course, is an international mission and something that we're excited to see happening. So last year, for example, we worked with the International Publishers Association and other bodies to bring accessible publishing concepts to the continent of Africa. There's a great series of activities where we delivered awareness training, technical training in English, French, and Arabic to publishers, together with publishers associations internationally and on the continent of Africa. And also to support government and non-governmental organizations in low and middle income countries where they don't yet enjoy even a library of accessible materials to support, say, access to education for people, young learners with print disabilities. We've come a long way because of sustainable development goals and the work of governments and non-profit organizations to ensure that many more young people with disabilities are actually engaged in school. So that's been a journey. But many people the young people with print disabilities, when they turn up at school, they don't have access to the textbooks in a format that they can read. And we come across teenagers who've never read even one book themselves because that's never been an option for them, and there isn't an awareness of that. So together with organizations like WIPO's Accessible Book Consortium, which is a private-public partnership, involves lots of parties around the table, from the rights holders and publishers area, from disabled persons organizations, and from specialist DAISY members, for example. We've worked on building the capacity of organizations in countries so that they can be producing accessible versions, primarily of education materials, using those international standards and best practices, so that they're then able to access those materials using the tools that exist, like free reading apps and conversion apps, and also contribute those into a global library of accessible materials, and to be able to make use of the treasure trove of materials that have already been produced over the years. So if you're in Francophone Africa, for example, or if you're in Spanish-speaking Latin America, there are many, many books that have already been produced that could be useful to you, as well, of course, access to your essential national content that could be used in schools and colleges and being read by your friends and family members.
Right. It's so interesting. I'm seeing a theme here that you're always thinking of kind of bridging nations and bridging cultures, and these technologies, but also bridging the tech industry and the publishing industry. And it's always something I found fascinating about hearing you speak, because you always have these contacts at all of these tech companies. You seem to have access there. Do you feel like people in publishing and people in tech understand each other? Do you feel like they're having the same conversations?
Well, sometimes they're in the same industry, I think. It might be hard to say whether someone is actually, am I in tech or am I in publishing? Because they're probably in
I think that's called a
publishing
niche.
or something. That's very blurry, increasingly blurry, is it not? I don't. So
Right.
Others may be better placed to answer the question of whether or not folk understand each other. If I come from an industry, I'm not sure I kind of entirely go along with this way of thinking about it, but sometimes people refer to the accessibility industry. And again, it's not separate, just as we discussed on publishing and technology, it's not separate to other industries, because, so much has been achieved, not by people working in an accessibility organization, but within those industries, within companies that are making televisions, within companies that are building software for mobile phones, within companies that make ATMs, that these folk who actually are often doing the hard work and are, talking with their colleagues, selling the ideas internally, making use of, what they're able to glean from what could be considered as the accessibility industry. But I think they're part of the accessibility movement, certainly themselves. Given that this is a podcast about publishing, what I would say is I've not yet met authors, publishers, booksellers who don't want their publications to be read by more and more people. So that's a great opportunity where and I've met many people with print disabilities who feel that they are excluded from many materials. So there's something to be done in that space, isn't there? You've got one group who wants more readers and one group that wants to read more. So some magic can happen there. And I would also say that culturally, again, golly, making big sweeping generalizations here, but I find that folk who working in the publishing space, so that it's a big ecosystem. It includes technology people, it includes people who are maybe app developers, also working on delivery models and those sorts of things. So not only publishers. I find it an easy conversation. People seem culturally well disposed to this thing, and I think that's because people get cultural inclusion and they think in a way along those lines. So as I said, sweeping generalization, but it's often it's a good conversation. It's a positive conversation. One isn't, fighting to get in the door or feeling like you're having an argument. It's not that. It's been like that in my career in some industries, but happily I've ended up, if I've ended up anywhere, I'm in a place anyway, working with wonderful people who are engaged in the whole publishing endeavor, and that works well.
Brilliant. Richard, we're coming up on the hour, but I'm so grateful for everything that you've shared with us. You're somebody I've always really admired for the way you can present very complex ideas in such a approachable way. I just wanted to ask you, is this something you've consciously cultivated from talking to people, or is it just naturally the way your mind works?
I don't know. What I would say is I've been around the block. I think it's several decades I've been working on these kinds of issues. What I would say is I've learned a lot from people with disabilities, and I would say that a lot of credit goes to the amazing people that I've met who've taught me things and have given me in learnings, and maybe that's what I'm able to bring to the table sometimes. So I just think of the hundreds of people I've met on all the continents I've been, in all the different experiences. And, I wake up each morning thinking, I remember they could, something they told me is going to be helpful to the person I'm meeting today or talking with today. So, it's that's something I do is carry all of those experiences and interactions with me.
Right. Conversation is everything, as we say doing a podcast.
Quite right.
Brilliant. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today and being the guest on this first ever episode of the Digital Publishing Podcast. How can people get in touch with you?
Well, you're very welcome to reach out to me directly on email as Orme. That's Romeo, Oscar, Romeo, Mike, Echo at daisy.org. You can find me on LinkedIn or find us via the contact us form on the DAISY website, daisy.org. I look forward to anyone contacting me. That's all good. And I'm looking forward to listening to the future podcast editions, Simon.
Thank you.
You'll probably have some interesting guests after this first one.
Honestly, Richard does undersell himself. It's so fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'll speak to you soon. And I will speak to all of you next time on the Digital Publishing Podcast.